Welcome to Suladan Reviews Dark Dream RHN. So, firstly, before I begin, I want to say I am referring specifically to the version from GameJolt listed as version 1.1. Any further development, any new updates, or any version coming from another website that may have differences that I am unaware of, I cannot account for everything, and I didn't want to download a copy from everywhere and play them all and make sure. I know this game is also on itch.io, and there's also an ArcHouse website, which we will get to when I get to that point. But I have to be really sure to stay on track, because I will tangent at every shiny thing if I don't. And there's a lot of tangents that I could go off onto, I guess. So, firstly, I'm going to cover the game's base menu. Okay, the first thing about the menu that I need to mention is, well, one, the loading menu and all is beautiful. I like the design. I have two complaints with it, though. Firstly, the little press any key to continue prompt that shows up in the bottom right shows up before the game appears to be ready to receive input. This causes player frustration because we want to push any button to continue as soon as it says push any button to continue. Minus the, minor little fraction of a second delay it takes us to register that it has appeared and whatnot. But I would suggest either A, make the game listen sooner, or B, delay the little prompt from appearing until the game is ready to listen. Either way works, but you don't want the prompt to be there when the player can then sit there and push buttons for a couple of seconds and nothing happen. It's just a little unpolished and something that could be fixed, either way. Secondly, the main menu with the WASD for info, quit, old game, new game. I really hope accidentally hitting new game doesn't instantly wipe your save. Not trying that. I assume that, like most games, you can start a new game as much as you want as long as you don't go to a save point. I haven't tested that. Would really like it if this game had had multiple save slots, but that's just because I'm used to multiple save slots. And because I am having trouble not thinking of Metroid. Because the game lists itself on GameJolt as a Metroidvania, which we will get to in a minute. That is also a little tangent. Thirdly, while on the topic of the menu, there is the in-game menu when you hit the escape key. Double tapping the escape key to quit the game is a dangerous thing. Most games have you tap once to enter the menu, tap a second time to leave the menu and resume playing. That's what I did the first time that I hit escape twice in this game. And I'm sure many people, or a large percentage of the player base of this game, would do the same. I'd recommend not doing that. Second reason for that, aside from us being used to hitting escape twice, is double tapping happens accidentally. Sometimes it's the same thing that used to cause problems in Windows 95 and 98, where Control-Alt-Delete twice would cause you to reboot the computer. You'd hit Control-Alt and then delete by accident because your finger would twitch. And boom, computer's rebooting. And you didn't want it to. And I'm really glad that's no longer a thing in computing. At least, the newer Windows that I've seen hasn't done it. I don't even think XP did it. I don't remember. It's been a while. Anyway, that's my main concerns with the menu. Otherwise, artistically speaking, the menu is beautiful. I love the info, old, new, out style. The main splash screen and all. It would be neat if there was Yeah, that's another tangent. Anyway, that's my feelings on the menu. Now, before I dive into the gameplay, the game itself, I want to poke at a few of the game's mechanics, because these things are going to come up throughout the entire game if I don't, so I'm going to go ahead and get them out of the way. First, the genre of the game, like I mentioned like a minute back, however long back. The GameJolt listing for the game, at least, lists the game as a survival horror Metroidvania. Now, the game does have survival horror, obviously, and it has certain aspects of a Metroidvania. But the two core ingredients of a Metroidvania are not in this game, leading me to call it a survival horror platformer with light Metroidvania aspects. I did find an older forum thread from the game's development that called it a survival horror action platformer, and I do think that's a little closer. I've not personally heard the term action platformer, but, I've seen action RPGs and regular RPGs, so I assume action platformer is a perfectly valid thing. But trying to call it a survival horror action platformer with light Metroidvania aspects sounds a little cumbersome and hard to roll off the tongue. But basically, the two core ingredients for a Metroid or Metroidvania game are backtracking and lots of upgrades. The idea being that the player is exploring, pretty much blindly. They run across something that they cannot overcome, be it an enemy or, some terrain detail, like a ledge I can't reach. Okay, the player continues on their way, eventually, finds a number of things they can't crawl. It just depends on how complex of a Metroidvania you're aiming for. Player eventually finds upgrade that allows them to do the thing, and then they can go on that path. And then they run into a dead end, another difficulty, find another upgrade, and so on and so forth, backtracking their way through the map, finding pathways that they could not previously traverse, but now can due to said upgrades. So basically, upgrades and backtracking are the two main mechanical components of a Metroidvania. Basically, I'm a little on the fence on whether I would call this game Metroidvania. Some of the levels taken in, or some of the rooms within, some of the areas do contain aspects that I could consider mildly Metroidvania. For example, in many of the areas, especially the earlier ones, I will platform my way through an area, find a locked door, and then have to platform my way back, find a button, which then opens the locked door. I can kind of call that backtracking. And then, you get the gun and the rocket launcher and the key thing and, I guess, upgrades. I really expected a lot more upgrades, I'm going to be honest, but I'm a big Metroid fan. Also a fan of the Mega Man game, so I'm going to be comparing it to those two a lot, because there's a few things that come up. But yeah, I generally think the game's strength lies more in its survival horror platforming, while taking inspiration from certain aspects of Metroidvania. Now, the visuals of the game are outstanding. Like, Arkhouse outdo themselves at every turn with their art style. They have a very unique and distinct art style, and I think they create a beautiful, beautiful game world. It is very deep and mysterious, and I want to know more about it, and I want to know more about the characters, and it kind of the phone rang. It kind of frustrates me a little bit that there's a lot of information that you can't really find in the game that I just blindly stumbled across, like via Google. When we get to that, I will, be putting that footage in so you can see some of said information. But for now, just know the visuals of the game are outstanding. I love them. I consider it very, very nice. I feel like the mechanics and a few things that are coming up are what holds it back. Likewise, the sound design of the game is outstanding. I don't necessarily like that I had to unpack the game files to get to the sound, because there's some music tracks in there I adore, like the fungal area. Beautiful. I do think that the music swells a little too loud, but I like the way that it swells and slowly grows. Grows, fungus. I just got that. Anyway, love the sound design. The enemies, the character movement, the background tracks, they're all very well done. So strictly from the, visual and auditory department, the game is outstanding. Arkhouse generally outdoes themselves in this department. Looking at their other games, this is generally their strong suit. I feel like, however, the game kind of struggles in some other areas. Before I get into player control, I want to go ahead and just mention as a base mechanic the difficulty curve of the game. There ain't one. Now, I don't mean the boss fights in particular, because there is a little bit of a curve when it comes to the bosses getting more complex, but the gameplay itself, there ain't one. If you're not enjoying the platforming in the tutorial, that's pretty much the game. Okay, I'll explain what I mean. Normally in a platforming game, the landscape, hazards, enemies, spikes, pits, jumps, etc. start small and grow as they go. If the game doesn't have upgrades, there's a limit to their growth. You will generally have small little single block pits that become bigger and bigger and bigger. Look at a Mario game. Level 1 versus in-game Bowser's Castle is going to have some very different hazards, very different size jumps, complexity of platform, moving objects, etc. Dark Dreams doesn't really do that. The spikes at the start of the game and the spikes at the end of the game are the same size. They're generally clustered pretty well the same. The pits are the same. The jumps are taking 90% of your maximum jump distance right out of the gate, right in the tutorial. Not a big fan of that, personally. Now, I enjoy the game, but I would have felt more of a sense of growth if the hazards had started smaller and then grown throughout the game. But having full-grown hazards at start to end, you don't get a sense of growth. Now, if the game was, say, a Metroid game, you would eventually have hazards you can't get over until you have certain upgrades, like, say, pits that you can't make it across without a double jump, or without a dash, or without some gimmick to do the thing. I could also compare it to a Mega Man game where you're not necessarily getting a lot of mobility upgrades, you're getting weapon upgrades. And in that case, look at the start of the game versus the last level of Wily's Castle, and whichever. I'm referring to the classic Mega Man games. Love the Mega Man X games, but for this purpose, I have to refer strictly to the classic games because they have more differences between them and Metroid games, whereas the Mega Man X games tended to have a bit more, upgrades for you to hunt out. Love the Mega Man X game. But anyway, if you look at the level layout, with some exceptions, like the infamous Quickman stage, generally the hazards in the main 8 areas, which could all be considered level 1, were lower than that of the end game. I'm not going to get into why the 8 areas could all be considered level 1, just say it's because it's somewhat non-linear and you can do it in whatever order. That makes difficulty curve design in games a whole other level of difficult for the designers. But in this case, the difficulty curve, bosses notwithstanding, is pretty much non-existent, but the game is linear, so you're just dealing with the same pits, the same hazards. Sorry, notwithstanding area gimmicks also. But strictly the platform, spike, and hazard layout is generally the same. You do get some unique enemies, but overall, if you can jump over the spikes in the tutorial, you can jump over the spikes near the end. I would have liked to have seen a wider variety of spike sizes and depths, and, naturally, as a Metroid fan, I would have hoped for more movement options. But that seems a good time to divert into the character controls, or player control. Character controls, because I am the player. Gonna go ahead and kind of bop the elephant in the room. The player's horizontal movement speed is atrociously slow. Now, when I first started this game, I told myself that, it's naturally slow because come after the tutorial, I'm gonna find a sprint ability that's gonna let me move at a reasonable pace so that I, as a player, will feel a sense of growth. And then later in the game, naturally, I'm gonna get more movement abilities so that sprint ability then feels weak by comparison. You get a 2-step sense of growth by putting the player in a position where they feel handicapped at the start. And then, some games do it in reverse, where you have a bunch of stuff at the start, then lose that stuff, and thereby feel the handicap greater, so that when you get that stuff you started with back, you feel stronger, and then you get stuff stronger than what you started with, and then you get a 3-step growth. But that generally works more when you're in a series like, say Metroid. Sometimes you'll start with stuff, then lose the stuff, then regain the stuff, then get better stuff. I don't know how that would work for a first game in a, presumably not series. But anyway, player movement is way too slow. Horizontally, the gravity, the vertical movement, That's pretty snappy and fine. I'm personally not a big fan of static jump height. I think that giving us a dynamic jump height would have allowed a lot more variety in the hazards and platforms, because you could have put overhead spikes that we would have to do little jumps to get over some ground-borne hazard without hitting the airborne hazard. By dynamic jump height, I mean the concept of your jump height varying depending on how long you hold the button. Many platformers use it. Many platformers use static jump height. It's not really a deal breaker, but basically the concept of a button tap and a harder held down button giving you a small and large jump respectively. I feel like those two things would have greatly enhanced the fluidity of character movement, made dealing with a lot of things like airborne enemies and the boss projectiles a lot more pleasant. Difficult, but pleasant. There's a difference in just difficult for difficulty's sake. Speaking of difficult for difficulty's sake, I may as well bring up the gun. I have two main problems with the gun. One, when you begin firing, your control inputs are locked. If you're standing still when you fire, you're going to be standing still until that entire animation plays out and the gun fires, and then a minor delay after. If you're jumping at this angle, you're going to continue jumping at that angle in whatever arc trajectory. You jumped straight up, you're going to continue going straight up and straight down. Locking the player input throughout that animation was a really uncomfortable thing. More often than not, it just makes firing feel cumbersome, and it doesn't make a great deal of sense. With the disclaimer, I do think I get where they're going with it, but I feel like from a mechanical stance, it's uncomfortable and doesn't reach the goal. My theory on the goal is that the weapon is a, quote, sword. And swords always have that thing where when you're swinging them, you're generally, well, okay, not always. I mean, Link swings a sword while running around, but that's different. Let's use Dark Souls, for instance. I'm rooted while I'm swinging my weapon. I can't dodge roll, I can't shield, I get to sit and watch and hope that whatever enemy doesn't hit me while I'm doing it. Okay. With the Dark Dreams RHN's surreal dream state, I kind of get why the gun could have a wind-up animation like a sword, but there's a reason that no other game that I'm familiar with has a wind-up on gun. Not counting if it's a weapon that has to be charged or has some associated gimmick, but in most cases where there's a charge or associated gimmick, you are able to move around while doing it, not counting certain fancy snipers. I've seen, I know Gungeon has some examples, but I've seen some games with examples of snipers that do like a beam charge up shot thing that roots you in place while it's charging, but that's generally done for that one weapon for a purpose of making, balance, and it fit the thematic of the weapon. But you had a choice on whether you used that weapon. But basically, because of the static jump height, not really because of, but because of the firing delay, the static jump height stands out worse. Because of the firing delay, the character's input, the player's input being rooted, locked. Sorry, I keep using the term rooted. When you're on the ground and unable to move, you're rooted. The character's input being locked while firing makes that stand out more. The firing delay doesn't seem to serve a function unless they're aiming for the, make it more sword-like. But I'm concerned that it's a form of artificial difficulty. It makes it very hard to aim with any precision at an airborne target. For example, let's say Mega Man again. Let's say boss has a weak point at a very specific vertical, y-axis height. It can be challenging to hit the boss on that weak point because of other things going on in the boss room, but the player always feels like they're in control of their shot. I know that if I hit the fire button at, this altitude, my shot will fire at that altitude and hit over there. Travel time notwithstanding, it follows a straight line. If it runs into something on the way, then whoops. But that feels good. It feels like it's in the player's control. With Dark Dreams, if the weak point is here and I hit the fire button here, I'm going to fire way down here or way up here because of what feels like... I haven't actually timed it, but it's at least feels like 2/3 of a second to me. It may be longer, it may be shorter. I really should have timed it. I'm worried that that was done strictly for difficulty reasons, and if it was, that is not a good idea. Artificial difficulty that feels artificial is unpleasant for the player. In either Mega Man or Metroid games, or other platformers involving guns, you generally always fire when you hit the button. There's not a tangible delay on your firing. If you've got to charge up to fire, you can run around while charging up, and then when you release the button, you know when you're going to fire. But in Dark Dreams, if I fire like right when I start a jump, I will fire at the peak of my jump. If I fire at the peak of the jump, I'll shoot the bullet as I land. This doesn't feel good. It feels cumbersome. At the beginning of the game, when I got the tutorial gun and saw that, my first thought was, this is surely just for the tutorial. There's no way that a game could do this. The rocket is actually a lot better of an example. There's a tiny delay on it, but it's so small that you generally would want to use it more. You should want to use the rocket more because it does more damage, not because it feels better to fire the thing. And I don't mean in a way that it's bigger and more explosive, because yes, people like explosions. I could say the same thing for the key launcher. Like, it has a pretty instantaneous thing. I basically, at the core, the three things control-wise that bother me. Slow movement speed. The static jump height just kind of bugs me. Not a huge thing. Slow movement speed and the firing delay would be the two main ones that are actually large problems. There's a lot of running around in this game, especially going from town to wherever. And it's boring when you spend 30 plus seconds just holding down a movement key and kind of just snoring. And that doesn't mean that you should just put a bunch of things to jump over. The amount of time it's taking and the character's movement feels slow. Some other games have gotten around this by either having the camera more zoomed in, which makes you feel like you're moving faster, having a greater parallax in the background to make it feel like you're traversing a larger area, or otherwise having more active and colorful environments, which wouldn't really fit in this game. An example could be the Sonic games. Your speed feels amplified by the parallax, the bright, colorful nature, and all of the activity going on in the world. Whereas this case, there's nothing really for you to look at but your character and appreciate the art. It's very, very beautiful backgrounds, by the way, but there's really not much for you to do aside from watch your character kind of sluggishly march around. The animation's nice, it just feels more like a walk cycle than a run cycle, and I feel like you should have had a run or sprint ability. Even if you were unable to fire the gun while using it, it would have made travel better. It also would have allowed you greater flexibility in your hazards, because you could have had some spikes or jumps that require you to sprint over them, then switch back to walking to jump over a smaller pit, then jump, then sprint, then do all the fancy things. It would have allowed for more to do. But those are my mechanical, issues / summary. I would recommend that for the gun, just get rid of the firing delay. That's nonsensical. Or have it so that when you hold down the button, he begins that animation and you just can't fire till it's done, but you can keep moving around, and then when you release the button, he fires. That would feel a lot better. A lot more control. And then the problem with some of the floating enemies, the problem with the floating enemies would vanish. I haven't mentioned that yet, but because of the firing delay, any airborne target is a nuisance to deal with, and generally you'll ignore, try to go around, or just tank. I mean, not counting bosses, but generally enemies, because you just don't want to deal with trying to hit a moving target in midair with imprecision. The ghost heads are my best example. I jump, I try to fire at them, and because of the delay, I fire below where they were, but because I'm in the air, they've begun flying up, so the bullet just goes past them, and then I'm just standing there like, well, that was a waste. And it still takes 2 shots to kill them when you manage to hit them, so you're likely to waste 4 or 5 shots, and you have limits on those, and we'll get into that in a bit. But, that's the mechanical concerns. Also, I should really say, I know I sound a little bit cynical on this, but I love this game. It frustrates me to see these mechanical problems because I feel like this game has so much potential. I feel like if these mechanical things were polished and redone a bit, that this game would be able to rise to so much greater heights. But as it stands, it feels artificially difficult and frustrating in ways that make players want to quit more than it makes them want to push through. I know why this is. I know how it happened. I know the history of the development. I know a bit of the history of the development, and I'll get to that later. But just for now, disclaimer, this is meant to be constructive criticism and in no way tearing this game down. It's a beautiful game. It has shortcomings, but I do love this game. Firstly, I should say the game does have a beautiful website, or I should say ArcHouse has a very nice website. There will be links to all of these websites in the description of the video, by the way, if you would like to see them. But this is the main website, which I stumbled across while trying to find some help with the third head. Not gonna lie, it took me 3 days to figure that out. Well, my problem was my initial assumption was that if I shot a rocket at a bullet block, they would just collide harmlessly. It took me like 3 days to realize that I hadn't actually tested that theory, and it turns out that rockets go through bullet blocks and vice versa. But as you can see, there's a lot of very nice artwork. And, Paper Town, that's going to come up later. Some information about the game that's not in the game. That's kind of all... I would use the trope term, it's all there in the manual, but there's not a manual. And this bothers me, and I will get to that in a minute. But the game has a very nice website. A lot of nice artwork. And then, of course, there's, different things that one can do here. There's an art book, the bestiary, which I, would have hoped had a lot of information about various things, but it's work in progress, and that's the bestiary. Not a lot of things that are much for the usefulness there. I mean, beautiful artwork, but not useful in terms of what a bestiary would normally be, which is, here is this enemy, here is a bio about this enemy, here is information about its behavior, in-game behavior, etc. Like that type of bestiary. But there's some beautiful art, and this art is also in the game's art book. Demon in the Box. That's a fun name. But, yeah. Likewise, on that website, there is the art book, which I would get if the art book, which, pardon, I can't figure out how to full screen an Adobe PDF, but it's a very nice art book. I feel like more information should have been in this, and it could have been fleshed out into a full manual instead of just being an art book. But there's a lot of gorgeous art and, concept stuff in here. I'm scrolling through it somewhat quickly. For instance, here you've got your player character who, actually doesn't have arms. I suspected it, but I never knew. Also, took me a long way into the game to figure out IAF was my character. Yeah, I had a little bit of trouble remembering character names. Would have been nice to, have this show up in the game like intro cards for the characters. Some bio information about them, which there is information on another website, which we'll get to in a minute. Captain Navigator, another Captain Navigator. I mean, different color, I guess. The King, the Origami Man, now known as the King. Another picture for him, just alternate pictures, I guess, and then some concept art. It is a really, really nice art book, though. Versions of the map. The enemy arts that I mentioned were in the art book. And, sorry, something started making noise and I'll have to check. Vertical Ace is the name of a character that's, to my knowledge, not in the final product. We'll get to that. It was in earlier development stuff. There was also this rail shooter section. There was a top-down section that the player would be in. There was also here's the top-down section. There would be an 8-bit arcade game section called Saturn Quest, which was, I assume, trimmed down to become what we now have as the arcade section. The white key section looks like it would have had a lightning barrier and such. There's an area with beds, whatever's going on there. Some different boss imagery. I'm just skimming through the whole book so that you can see, but it's a very nice book. Now, I don't have a clue what's going on with the maze, but I consider that to be like the back cover of the book. There's a save point and some key blocks. It also turns out that they made Ghost Dream. I loved that game. It had beautiful art, but like Dark Dreams, it had some little mechanical problems. Namely, some of the puzzles were pixel hunts, which means that they required a high amount of precision, knowing exactly where you needed to click, and sometimes the click box for that was too tiny. If you knew where they're at, they're easy, but if you don't know where they're at, some of the puzzles were too hard. But of course, puzzle difficulty is very subjective because everybody will follow a different chain of logic there. Like, had I not assumed that the rockets wouldn't go through the bullet blocks, it may not have taken me 3 days to figure out. Saturn Quest and some other, other games they make. Where's the other one? Where's the other one? Where are you? No. Oh, there it is. I forgot. That's why I couldn't find it. Okay, the reason I couldn't find it, I forgot that the link wasn't called Dark Dreams RHN. The original name of the game was Romantic Horror Nights, which is maintained now in the RHN of Dark Dreams RHN. March 1st, 2018 is when it began, and I'm assuming this was edited since then once the game was finished, because I know sometimes when people begin a thread, they edit it and work their way through as it's done with a mixture of new and old kind of remaining as part of the thing. But see, here's where I mentioned before that it is listed as a survival horror action platformer and action platformer. I feel like a lot of this changed between then and now because it's not a split personality world as much as it is Dreams now. So perhaps that changed over time. Because there's no voice from above, there's now the king. You're not explained as being a horror monster, even though looking at the character you kind of assume it. I feel like a lot of lore and story may have been there that wasn't. But here's the website that I mentioned where you find the information about the characters that's not in the game and not in the manual, and I would have loved to have at least had a little PDF manual with all this in it. Because it feels like it would feel kind of more like the older games where, due to mechanical limitations, you couldn't have a lot of lore and story in the game, so a lot of things were explained in the manual, which is why there's a trope called "it's all there in the manual." Like, you'd have Mario games where, the explanation of Mario and Bowser and all was in the manual. You'd have little arts for a lot of the random enemies and controls and things. The tutorial used to be in the manual. But Beautiful Prisoner is an interactive art form, which explains what IAF stands for, which would have been really good information to have when I played it. A robot designed for artistic purposes. Each time his charging mode is activated, he's entering the ruined paper world of origami, which makes me feel like it's the dreams of the machine. Because, generally people equate, robots going into charging mode with their sleep. Origami Man, who I presume became the king. It's at least the form he has. Origami Man is living alone on Saturn. He is the king of the ruined paper world, which he built to escape loneliness. Which explains why so much of the game's main world looks like it's made of paper. Another thing that could have been explained. Captain Navigator is the 8-bit hero of an unreleased Sega Blaster game called Saturn Quest. And yes, I know it says Saga Blaster, but I assume that's for legal reasons. Because, Sega. The prototype of the game, when run on an emulator installed on a discharged IAF, forms a portal leading to the ruined paper world of Origami, which makes me feel like, that it wasn't originally a dream as much as it was. Somebody got warped there. Vertical Ace seems to have been removed, but he would have been a character with a god complex. I assume he got fused in with what became the king. Mysterious voice coming from inside the ruined paper world of Origami. He is the creator of Beautiful Prisoner and a love interest of the Dark Muse Barbara. And Barbara is, if memory serves, the weird one that speaks in caveman speak. To me, Barbara, you pretty. That sort of stuff. And there was apparently a light muse, Angela, created from the dark affinity of Vertical Ace, confronting Beautiful Prisoner, believing she can use him as a vessel to reach the world of Vertical Ace. I'm guessing she became the princess, but I don't know. I mean, aesthetically speaking. The opposite of Dark Muse Barbara. Let's see. To close the portal for good, Captain Navigator must reach the true ending of Saturn Quest. This, however, will create a massive black hole that may destroy an asteroid or two. I would have loved for all these random lore bits to have been somewhere where they were accessible, either in the game or out of the game. Because it does feel like there's a lot that's not explained that, like, say, for instance, Dark Souls could have led to player curiosity and interest because the lore is there if you dig into it. It's the reason games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Dark Souls have, in some ways, such a... There's something about mysteries that can be solved that are just magnetic to people. The lore is there, but you have to work for it and hunt for it. It's one of the things Metroid Prime 1 did so well, was having lore scattered through the game. Where some games will have seemingly random enemy placement that ties into lore, like, my introduction to the crab squid in Subnautica actually having lore purposes, when I later found a diary or, audio log explaining why that crab squid was there. These are little details of game design that can draw a player deeper into a world and make them want to continue digging and learning and reading and, whatnot. Top-down area, I'm really curious about what that would have been. The 8-bit Saturn Quest I know was removed, like I saw a devlog on that. Or it may have been a post in the forum here, I don't know. I dug around a lot. But yeah. The game dev also said that this may be their last game, depending on how it was received. And that worries me because while this game is beautiful, it has some mechanical difficulties that I think could turn players off of it. And I don't want it to be the final straw that breaks a game creator that has this kind of potential. Because they clearly have outstanding artistic talent. They just... We'll get into the reason, some of that later, but, more testing, different testing, more explanation later. Anyway, now we can get on to the area by area reviewing. I don't know why that word escaped me for a moment, but we can get on to that. If I would have hit the button and moved the thing. Why did you move over? What? Why are you over there? Stay. It jumped everywhere. My little OBS window with which the recording is done with needs to hold still. Why are you using that? There we go. Why were you using the software encoder? Moving on. Okay, the first area I'm going to describe is basically the where you enter the game world and then, up to the town, stopping prior to the tutorial. Honestly, the intro is pretty great. My main complaint would be that the area, due to the player's low movement speed, takes a bit more time to traverse than it could, but it's an introduction area, so for it to be larger, it kind of works. It gives you time to think and kind of immerse. I like the paper net and all that. But the design feels very nice and cohesive. The area, the people in the town are very unique and interesting. And while I would make the suggestion to, during dialogue, I like that you have their faceplate image and the text and all. Put a name tag below the faceplate, please. Because of the fact that a lot of the information on the characters is not in the game, I at least had trouble remembering some of the characters, like their names. I knew Barbara, but that's kind of hard to forget. Like, it took me a while to remember Captain Navigator's name. I just knew him as Saturn Guy. I just think it would be a nice little bit of polish. That's not really a complaint as much as I just think that might add a little bit of improvement. But the characters are interesting and unique. I would like to know more about them. You've got the guy that's going on about rail shooters, which I assume is a remnant of the fact that there was a rail shooter in the game at one point. You've got the kid that wants you to be his vassal, and I don't really know what's going on there. The lady that doesn't remember her own name, Barbara. Lady that doesn't remember her name, comma, and Barbara. Different people. Barbara remembers her name. Barbara doesn't remember how to English, but Barbara remembers her name at least. I like that the main town feels like a proper hub. One direction leads to an area where a guy's saying, don't go that way, there's enemies. And if you go that way, lo and behold, there are enemies. There's rooms where you see bullet and rocket blocks. There's a room where you see key doors you can't get through and key blocks. And then a direction that leads forward, obviously. But it feels like a nicely designed hub world, and I like the artistic style, the fact that it's made of paper. I feel like a lot more lore could have been done with that if each of these areas are truly either disconnected worlds or different dreams. A lot could be done with that story-wise to kind of bring it cohesively together, because then you would have the origami world being the hub from which these other branches are growing out from. Overall, I think the town's pretty nice. I like it. I like the layout of the rooms. I like the layout of the buildings and the people, and the art style is pretty nice. I don't have a lot to complain about there. Now, on to the tutorial area. Likewise, the art style holds about the same as the town. It's part of the town, so I would expect it to. It is a nice introduction to the game's mechanics. But like I mentioned before about difficulty curve, I feel like the tutorial spikes and pits and all are a little, as somebody who's played a lot of platformer games, I'm fine with it, but I don't feel like it's good for a tutorial area for there to be no difficulty curve. I would have liked to have seen smaller spikes and pits and such. As for the enemies, the mannequins are great. The surprise monster mannequin after the boss is great. And the boss is pretty interesting and well done for a mannequin. It's not supposed to be challenging as much as it is informative for the player. Now, my complaint comes in the fact that if you defeat the boss with low health like I did, and then don't have enough health to kill the monster mannequins after the boss, you have to close the game and restart the game. I had, fewer health than I needed to fire the bullets. One of the difficulties in having bullets that cost health, but being so close to the beginning of the game, I didn't really take as much time to mention it. But it is an example of a deeper problem in the game's design, which allows the player to get permanently stuck. In that case, permanently stuck because I didn't have a previous save point to loop back to. In the future case, permanently stuck because I saved and then had no way to go back because no backup saves, no multiple save points, which both would be bandages trying to fix the underlying problem. I will get to that when I get to that area. But overall, the tutorial is pretty nice. I feel like it should have had a lower difficulty ceiling on the spikes and pits and platforming that then would have grown throughout the game. But, it is what it is. The enemies are nice, the boss is nice, and aside from the minor complaint about getting stuck, it's a nice tutorial. I like it. Now, after the tutorial, we go right. We leave the town, and then we talk to Captain Navigator again, and then we end up in the first of the two Saturn areas. Or the first of the two, what I consider to be the Saturn areas. The Saturn machine, or Saturnian machinery, or, whatever you decide to call it. It's a really interesting level, design-wise. It starts as this kind of barren foreign landscape, and as you traverse into it, it becomes more and more mechanical. Now, I don't know if I was, making my way into a crashed ship or some base, but I like the way the art starts one way and kind of blends into another, and the characters and their dialogue and all leads into that. And then you find the gun there. The enemies in the area are pretty nice. They fit in the area. The mannequins on wheels that roll back and forth, the floating drone things, they feel like they fit in the area. And they're not, obtrusive. They're not bothersome. They're, just enemies. Overall, it's a good area. Now, the boss is interesting and unique, but I don't really understand how it fits the area. It's the giant creeping mass with a face on it. The same one that catches up and eats us in the credit sequence. I assume it ate us. Everything wants to eat us. But design-wise, I'm a little puzzled as to how it fits into the Saturn machine theme. It feels out of place. Maybe it's an invader. Maybe it invaded the ship. Maybe that's why it crashed. Maybe it invaded the base. I don't know what it is. I'm assuming it's a ship. That's just how I visualize it as as a player. The boss fight itself isn't too bad. I do feel that the random nature of the y-axis where it shoots its shots could be a little annoying, because there's times where I would jump and then it would fire, and then there'd just be nothing I could do to avoid it, because, it would catch me right when I was coming back down from the jump. On the one hand, it'd be nice if it would track the player and try to fire where they are or where it thinks they're going to be, but at the same time, that could make it too predictable. So I don't really know what to suggest there. The boss is not so difficult as to make that a problem. I just think that a little polish could be done, but I just don't know what to recommend. I like the way that it's creeping towards you and you're having to backpedal while dealing with the spike pits and the mannequins. I feel like the spike pits are, again, too large for such an early point in the game, though, and that their positioning could be better dealt with. If the lower difficulty there is bothersome design-wise, you could then increase the complexity of the room by having some little platforms that the player could be using to climb over certain spike pits, or, have some vertical stuff to be doing. But overall, I like the boss. I like the room and the design of the area. But, it felt like a nice first proper boss. It's the first one you come across after the tutorial. And I generally don't really have any complaint there. I feel like there's a little that could be improved, but overall pretty decent. Now, when we leave the first Saturn area, we find our way into the second Saturn area, which, very beautiful, very unique, very pink. That's my first thoughts. That's the three things there. The theme for the area does feel very much like you're crawling through you're either inside of a fungus or a cave that's been overrun by fungus. And it's a very pink fungus. Very nice and interesting color palette. I like the pink choice. It fits, it feels foreign to the area, and it just really works. I like the layout of the area. I love the portal gimmick. I like that many of the rooms begin to become very vertical, so that you're climbing across and across and across, and sometimes serpentine, sometimes not, due to a portal gimmick. The vertical nature of the rooms covers very well for the player's low horizontal movement speed, because climbing and jumping and working your way vertical feels faster. It also plays well into the portal gimmick, and it means that if you fall off of a platform, you're not instantly dying as much as you have a chance to land on a lower tier and just have lost progress. I like that. I like the way it felt, and I like the way it played into the sometimes finding the door and then having to figure out where in all of that the button was. I also like the enemies in the area, the floating jellyfish mushrooms that shoot lightning bolts. They're outstanding, they're gorgeous. They intrigue me. Likewise, the Saturnian drones make a return, but this time with spike cannons. I assume they're spikes. They look like spikes to me. They may just be two bullets next to each other, but to me, they best visualize as spikes. They tie the two areas together, and as you progress through it, you do see some of the Saturnian machinery. So I like that the two areas cohesively tangle into one another. The pits and platforming and all suffer slightly from the same aforementioned, there's no difficulty curve. The gimmicks cover up for it pretty well, the portals and the spike traps, and the spike drones and all. The area generally feels very cohesive, very nice, and has one of the best soundtracks in the entire game, if I may be so bold. That soundtrack there, for this area, is the reason that I unpacked the game, because I wanted that soundtrack. And for some reason, the Game Jolt soundtrack only has 5 songs in it, which this is not one of them. There's a lot of sound files in there. It's a very nice sound file, though. Highly recommend. Highly like it. I don't know if it's just Game Jolt. Maybe itch.io has the full soundtrack. Maybe it's, I don't know. Just puzzles me a bit. But overall, the area is wonderful. Likewise, the boss. At first glance, I felt like the boss was out of place. But the more I look at it, the more I feel like, I later noticed in the background you've got those eyeball-like growths. I feel like that's the fungus, so the boss makes sense. It's either the core of the fungus or it's a face that's being overrun by that fungus over its eyes. Either way, it does fit in the area. It just took a little bit to sink in. The boss fight is nice. I like the way the portals are integrated into it, but there's a problem. Okay. The weak point will either spawn on the left or on the right. You have to run with your slow movement speed underneath the face of the main boss, which will periodically send out tracking portals that will want to teleport you to the left or the right side in the spike pit. Problem is, due to the low movement speed, it can be a pain to walk your way across without getting caught in the portals. And due to the random nature of which side the weak point will appear on, sometimes you can get lucky. Shoot it on the right side, it'll reappear on the right side. Shoot it on the right side, it'll reappear on the right side, and so on. And likewise, due to the short range of the portals, if you get on the side with the weak point, you can stand there and be completely out of harm's way. Now, this normally would be a problem, but because you have to line up your shot, the boss is too big for you to damage. Captain Navigator is, due to some very clever, depth perception things, giant right now because he's closer to the camera. You have to shoot the weak point to make noise to tell him when to fire, and his targeting reticle is moving back and forth across the field. So, again, the firing delay plays a little bit here, but it's not a huge hassle because you're not under threat. You have to time your shot on the weak point so that it hits when the thing is over the face, so that he will then shoot his giant rocket launcher at the face. And then the weak point is, of course, moving in a circular pattern, giving you a little bit of a challenge to hit it, but it's not that big of a challenge. It's not that bad. Overall, very nice boss fight. I like it a lot. And then after the boss, you get his rocket launcher. I assume it's his because he was firing rockets, and then and then you find a rocket launcher. But it's an overall very nice boss, very nice area. One of my favorite areas in the game. I love the portal gimmick. I love the way the area was vertically aligned. I love the soundtrack. I love the fungal theme. It just all really tied together in this really nice cohesive package. And, as such, I like it. Okay. So, as for the next area, I'm kind of going to lump the area and the boss together because the next area amounts to one room. Come out of the pipe, you go right, there's the one room, then boop, boss. Going to call the area the harbor, though, because it houses a whale. I know the game wants to call it a dragon, but I shall call it a whale. Looks like a whale brain, a brain-shaped whale. A whale-shaped brain or a brain-shaped whale, however you want to put it. In any case, the theme is interesting. I like the way that the area shifts to a new color palette. You've got a lot more dark colors. The blue of the rocks is really striking. And the haze that rises from the water is nice and plays nicely into the ghostly heads that follow you around. Do have a minor visual critique with the particles that float side to side, kind of standing in contrast to the steam. I would say thicken the steam slightly, remove the particles, and then let the the Steam be the thematic, I guess. Oh. The floating heads have a minor problem in that their design is nice. I like their gimmick about being hard to see, and it mixes with the Steam well. I do have a slight problem in that I can feel the eye strain when dealing with them because while trying to traverse, you're also trying to watch for very difficult to see floaty heads. And then due to the fact they're airborne enemies and the way the gun reacts with airborne enemies due to the firing delay, there's more negativity there than there could be. Their position spawning in the room appears to also be random, so in some cases running through the room you won't even have to deal with them, and in other cases they'll be an unavoidable obstacle in your path. As for the whale, it's a bit of a complicated story. My problem, this is the first instance of a case where I found a player who would, I guess this is the first instance I ran into where getting stuck was an option. And I mean permanently stuck, as in I don't have enough bullets to continue, must restart game. I found a way around it at the time by saving one more rocket and then using that to make up for the 3 missing damage I needed, because the rocket will do 4 damage. But I find that to be problematic. My recommendation would be A, there's a bullet drop in the whale boss room. Put a second one. The whale takes 30 damage total. Make sure the player can has it. You don't want situations where the player can get stuck, and like I mentioned before, there needs to be some way to make sure that the player can regain a minimum amount of ammo for, especially for boss encounters. In my case, I found a way to deal with it, like I said, with the rocket, because once you deal 20 damage, you can get a bullet drop. I had 17 bullets and 1 rocket, so 21 damage, basic math. The boss fight itself is pretty straightforward. I like the boss fight. The first phase, you're just dealing with the whale, summoning the little, serpentine pattern moving things, which have varying patterns, and I like that. There's enough platforms for me to jump around on. My bullets pierce, they destroy the things, and can hit the boss in the same shot. And generally, they're straightforward enough that you can learn their patterns and jump over a lot of them. I like their variations and their frequency, and it just all works together well. The second phase, I start to have mixed feelings because floating heads begin to get involved into the fray. So there's a bit more pressure to rush, and instances where you'll be jumping over something, run into a floating head you didn't see, and then fall to your death. Instances where they'll take shots that were aimed at the whale, etc. And then the third phase. I have a mixed feelings about it. I adore the addition of the lightning, but I think the floating head should be removed for the third phase so that you can focus more on the boss fight, because at that point, generally, it just became a mash the button and try to take it down before it takes me down while tanking lots of lightning bolts. This initially led me to defeat the boss with 9 health remaining, which, without going too much into the next area, caused me to get stuck in a situation where I had to restart the entire playthrough, which you want to avoid as much as possible in game design. Restarting an area, a level, fine. Restarting the whole game, that's a bit touchier. But I'll cover that when I get to the arcade area. On second run through, I was much more conservational with my ammo because I knew where ammo drops were, I knew where enemies were, I knew how much damage I could tank before the next save point, before the next health refill, and things like that allowed me to, with that foreknowledge, do much better. Now the fight went much the same, although I discovered a bit of an exploit in that if you die right after defeating the whale boss, you'll respawn at the start of the room as normal with, your health and ammo refunded, but the whale will still be dead. It was very tempting to use that exploit, but I didn't, at least for the playthrough. But it does exist. Now, overall, I like the whale. It's an interesting boss fight. I personally would suggest, if the firing delay was fixed, I think the floating heads would be much less of a problem. I still recommend that on the third phase, the floating heads should be removed, because there's so much other stuff going on that they're just their presence is an issue. To me, it's an issue. It takes away from the boss itself. There can be too many things going on at once, and some later bosses will get into that more. But overall, the whale is a very interesting boss. Interesting aesthetically. Brain-shaped whale, or whale-shaped brain, or whatnot. And the fact you can see remnants of old weapons sticking out of it where previous warriors or knights or whatever have failed to slay it. Since technically the game's treating it like a dragon, and I've seen that done with like a lot of dragons in world building and such. Various movies, TV shows, books, video games, etc. have done that. So it's an interesting thing. So yeah, not a bad boss, not a bad area, just a few little unpolished bits. My main concern would be make sure that the player can't accidentally run themselves out of ammo in a way that they can't like die, retry, and then do better. It's when you get stuck at the point where you entered the room with too little that it's an issue. Or I should say, between the previous save point and that room. Because, I mean, if you have too little ammo at your last save, then there's nothing that can be done, and it's frustrating. Moving on from the whale, we move into what I call the 8-bit area, which I presume is what's left of the old Saturn Quest stuff that would have been in the game. I love the visual theme. It's interesting, it's got a bit of variation, the enemies feel like they belong there. And, given the dreamlike nature of the game, it's really neat to shift from, one theme to another like that. The enemies, I mean, for the most part, the little sideways ground ones, a lot of the enemies use the same AI. They're just the mannequins on wheels with a new skin, and the floating angry heads are they're not using the same AI as the floating heads. They just kind of do an airborne serpentine path, but they will change direction to try to follow you, and they're slightly slower than you, so you can outrun them. But, the enemies all fit into the area. I like the area as a whole, but the way the area branches makes it a little hard to cover. So first, the yellow area, pretty well done. The enemies are nice, the platforming is nice, and I like the gimmick of the platforms aren't what they seem to be. The solid ones that pulse are fake, and the transparent ones that pulse are real, and stuff like that is neat. Now, continuing forward from there, I was low on health and looking for a save point. I ended up finding it, I think by trial and error, but leads you to a save point. Also Captain Navigator in his Saturn Quest 8-bit form, which is, I must say, adorable. But I saved there, and I only had 2 health left. Because I was sure, naturally, there's going to be a health station near a save point. That's just basics. Or there's going to be a way for me to move forward, because no game would ever let me get stuck. I mean, I'm not saying no game would, but these are generally, little presuppositions that we bring with us to gaming, that you're not going to get stuck and have to restart the entire game. If you get stuck, you can reload. Things like that. Well, there's 2 paths forward from this place. There's 3 paths, technically. One path involves, if you go all the way before the whale boss to the door that I saw that was locked, if you shoot the bullet block, step on the button, the door will open. That requires 2 bullets, which would require a minimum 3 health. I had 2 health. Likewise, to the bottom right and the top right of the arcade and the 8-bit area are enemies that must be shot, and, beyond said enemies are not ways forward. One of these 2 enemies, however, back to the yellow area, top right, you have the giant red thing that doots back and forth and that you have to, climb up the platforms and shoot. Beyond it is a health station. The problem, it deals 10 damage, so unless you have 11 or more health, you can't tank it to run to the health station. And likewise, it takes, I think 4 or 5 rockets. I forget how many rockets are fired at the thing to take it down. So yeah, it's a pain to get to unless you have the resources. You either have to have the health or the ammunition, or both, to get to it. So that's where my initial playthrough stopped, because I couldn't make it farther forward in any path, and the way back to town was blocked, because I knew there was a health station before the whale. Now, my second playthrough, I reached there with, I think, 30-something health. And after defeating the giant red thing, found the health station and was not too thrilled. But the layout of the area is not the problem. The area is nicely designed, but I would recommend either A, make save points repair you to 20/30 health, or move that health station down to the save point. Putting it behind an enemy that takes a lot of health or ammo to deal with, or, well, health and ammo, you can either tank through it with a lot of health or shoot it with a lot of health and a lot of ammo. Putting it behind that was a bad idea and is the thing that led to me getting stuck. Even if the health station was just hidden in a different room, but reachable without having to shoot things, it would be better than having it behind a large enemy like that. Put another key up there or something, but not a health point. The health point should be back down with the save point. The point being, the ability to get stuck there is a problem, and I would recommend revising the area layout slightly to reflect that. To fix that. Now, ignoring that, the enemy placement and all is nice. I like the giant red thing and having to fight my way past it to get something. And likewise, I like that the other pathway leads to some interesting things. Now, the gray area, which I'm honestly convinced is made of little Red Cross first aid kits, because they're box shaped and they have what to me looks like a grayscale version of the Red Cross symbol on them. That's just what they make me picture. The layout of the area is interesting to me, and I like it. My problem, the gimmick in the area is well-intentioned but clunky. I like that you have what I'm convinced are giant medical syringes spawning horizontally and vertically to try to hit you while you're, exploring that area. I've two main problems with it. One, there's a chance of them spawning at the same instant or very close to one another. If you can't jump over the horizontal one without hitting the vertical one, you've put the player in a position of unavoidable damage, and generally that's not fun, especially when it can infinitely happen the longer you're there. Not counting areas where you have a damaging atmosphere, like say Metroid Prime 2's Dark Aether, before you get the proper defenses for that, or areas where the player is meant to be pressured into rushing, but those are done in a way where you're taking damage over time, not taking damage from collisions with actual enemies. It's technically still collisions with hot particles is still burning you, and but one, make them not be able to spawn together. Two, allowing them to spawn at any instance in time leads to many situations where they will spawn while the player is mid-jump. There's many cases where I would be mid-jump and hit the vertical one because it spawned right when I jumped or right after I jumped and I couldn't do nothing about it. Or the horizontal one spawned while I was mid-jump and I couldn't land and jump again fast enough to get out of its way. Or it would spawn just high enough I couldn't jump over it, but it's low enough it would clip my head, since the character cannot crouch or duck or anything. I'm not saying to add that for the one area, but these are things that need to be taken into account. My recommendation would be, one, when one of them spawns, have a timer in the background that prevents the other one from spawning for however long. And two, when the spawn condition is met, check if the player is in midair. If not, wait until the player has landed, presumably for some fraction of a second after they've landed, then spawn it. Even better, have some little RNG decide how much longer after they've landed to spawn it, but then you get into what if they jump again, and you've got to have ways to account for that. But making sure that the player is on the ground when it spawned ensures that it is a challenge that can always be dealt with, meaning that the difficulty feels more like it's based on skill than random luck. Because there were many cases where I would just stand there, twiddling my thumbs, waiting, for it to spawn so I could jump over it, because I knew if I tried to jump to the next platform, my luck, it was going to spawn and either knock me off or, take unavoidable damage. I like the area and the gimmick. Minor issue, though, with their bright red coloration in what is otherwise a grayscale area. I would recommend them either being grayscale in some way or otherwise a color that does not contrast quite as highly with the gray, because the bright red feels out of place given the coloring of the area. Beyond that, though, you've got the room where what I only assume are giant floating eyeballs are spawned, and you have to shoot them and they get bigger, and then you get past them and oh look, a key. This area has a lot of just to do with finding keys. It's an interesting room. My main problem with it, one, the bright red contrast with the grayscale again, and two, I was low on health and ammunition, so that kind of tainted my experience slightly. But I got no problems with them. I do think recoloring them might be useful, match them to whatever changes are made to the previously mentioned one. But, they're nice, neatly done. Now to loop back to the save point in the 8-bit area, because that's where the boss is. Hey, it's neat that it was unique. I'm a bit confused by this boss, actually. I presume it may have been a remnant from either the rail shooter or the Saturn Quest minigame that was going to be in this game. But when a boss uses such a change in themes and genre without explanation, one, it feels disjoint from the game. Two, there's a lot of the boss fight itself that goes unexplained. I do not know what the two bars floating back and forth at the bottom of the screen are. There's a little red one and a big white one, and then there's the little white one, which is my reticle. I figured that out. Am I supposed to be timing my shots to line up with that? Am I supposed to be not timing my shots to line up with that? I didn't have the patience to sit there and try to figure it out because the thing was shooting at me. Likewise, I feel that the hitbox for shooting down the counterattacks is a little tight, partially because you're moving a cursor with the, key commands, which makes it a little clunky for landing on specific spots. There's a lot of times where I would land right next to it, shoot, and miss. A little annoying. I'm also curious what the 4 cube shapes on the boss face are. But overall, the boss fight isn't too bad. The boss fight is interesting. I just feel like more explanation should have been done. Captain Navigator is right there. He could have had a little more exposition to explain what this upcoming boss was. I like it. I just think it needs more explanation and a little tweak to the hitboxes on the counterattacks. Also, a health bar of some kind would be nice, even if it just shows me my health. But that's, minor critiques. Overall, the arcade section is a nice change of pace. There's a few little things that need polishing, and then a health station that needs moving. But aside from that, it's really coherent. Visually, between the landscape and the enemies, the sounds, I like it. It's a pretty nice area, and it has an interesting boss that's an interesting change of pace from other bosses. It just needs explanation. Now, with the arcade section complete and with its 4 associated keys collected, you can head back up and shoot the bullet block above the button, which opens the door that lets you back to town. Once in town, you begin going through some of the side tangents that you could not previously, such as the left area that you were warned had enemies, where you find another key. The puzzle blocks beyond Barbara, which had another key. And, oh, no, that was it. There were 6 keys. For some reason I was convinced there were 7, and I was at a loss for where to get the 7th one. But with those 6 keys, you can then go on the path that leads you through the big key doors. Which is basically, it reminds me a lot of the tutorial, just longer, a bit more difficult, and with some new enemies. Very nice thematic, very nice new enemies. And the enemies in the area really feel like they fit cohesively within the theme of the town. They match the style of the mannequins, their color palette and all. And both old and new alike come out to play, along with landmines and spikes, and just the whole area feels pretty nice. It's a nice little traversal down a serpentine path where you use up all your keys to get through the doors. And once you get to the bottom of that path, you find yourself at a train. Now, the train is neat because it is both really simple in layout. It's a sequence of rectangular rooms, but it's also unique. The train, you perceive movement due to the background and all, even though, as one of the NPCs points out, you're not moving at all. It's all an illusion because it's just the background moving. The area is neat. It's got a low ceiling. You can't really do much jumping, and each time you go through the same train cars, things get a little more corrupted. You know, the shadows start showing up on the ceiling or in weird places, and then suddenly these giant eyeball-headed critters start spawning. You know, you're busy dealing with the spikes, and they spawn, and they start releasing these explodey shadow particles, and it's all really unique and interesting, and I like the train section. I don't really have any suggestions, aside from the segments of moving spikes where you're having to jump between them, increasing the size of the gap between them slightly to make it easier for the player to walk along with them when they are required to do so. It just felt like one thing that came up a few times, and it was more frustrating than challenging. But otherwise, you know, the train section is pretty cool, pretty well done. I really enjoyed that area. It is one of the areas that, like the fungal area, stands out to me as really interesting. Well, the arcade section too. The arcade section just has some polish to do. The train and the fungal area stand out to me both for that and for the fact that I don't really have a lot of things that I would recommend changing. In any case, once you get off the train at its next destination, which it's technically never moved, you're just on the other side of the cliff. Again, it's neat. You find what is basically Harbor Part 2. It's the harbor again. But while it may look thematically the same, there's a lot of differences in the platforms. Now you're riding moving platforms. There's some bullet blocks that you can either shoot or jump over. It plays with the I don't know who originated the concept. I've seen it in Mario games where you're riding a moving platform, then you have to jump up onto a landmass and then make your way over the landmass before the platform, gets too far ahead so you can jump back onto the platform. That was neat. There was also the fact that if the platform does get away, you can stand there and wait for it to come back and then, catch it on the next go. But still, it's neat. I like it. And then it even brings the portal gimmick back into play, which was amusing and interesting. A little frustrating, but overall, I rate it fairly highly. I like the second harbor. Floating heads again. That's always nice. But I've said about all that I really can when it comes to the floating heads. They're not bad enemies. It's just the fact that shooting at airborne targets is such a pain makes any airborne target a pain. So I believe fixing that would fix them by proxy. So I'm not, really criticizing them a whole lot. Now, as for the boss, the second head of the dragon, thematically and visually, it's beautiful. Love it, and I love that it has some new tricks up its sleeve. Its proverbial sleeve. My problem, there's too much going on too rapidly for the player to really... Okay. For explanation, the boss is basically in the background. The only part in the foreground is a big glowing red eye, which I feel should be the weak point, but I'll get to that in a minute. Now, from the sides of this eye, it fires mortars, which hit various platforms, but those mortars are right at your jump height, and you'll generally be jumping face first into them frequently, either jumping when they fire, jumping before they fire, jumping after they fire. It's a pain. There are likewise some vertical projectiles that will rain down, and when they hit the water, a whalehead pops up and bites wherever they landed instantly. My problem is the combination of these two don't synergize well together. No, what I mean is the sideways mortars block the player from jumping. And yes, the player can wait for them to fire, wait till it's safe, then jump. But in many cases, you don't get that opportunity because of the vertical shot. You've got to jump out of its way because as soon as it lands, the whale's going to come up and bite you. My recommendation would be A, when the vertical shot lands, have a delay before the whale spawns so that it's a looming threat, but the player has to deal with it still. Making it instantaneous is not really the best decision to me. I would have gone with a delay. Secondly, instead of having the mortar shots fire just straight out and hit the ground like that, have them fire up, have markers at the top of the screen where basically these are where the mortars are going to land. That platform over there is the safe one. You've got to get to it before they land. So it fires, you've got to track that. While you're jumping over there, you've got the other particle. Have more than one of the vertical things shooting down to distract you. And then, wherever it lands, you've got to worry about in 2 seconds or 3 seconds after it lands, a whale's going to pop up. Now, you would have to be careful to make sure that it doesn't put the whale as spawning where the safe platform is. But by having the mortar shots fire up and then come back down, they wouldn't be blocking the player's movement as much. Likewise, you could also just make the arena a solid floored area, and then the mortars wouldn't be a problem. It's the fact that you're standing on a series of little platforms that require you to jump, and then taking the player's ability to jump and using it against them, that feels unrewarding. Now, as for the weak point, I like what you're trying to do. The weak point is centered on the eye, but it does this from the top to the bottom, to the top to the bottom. It doesn't quite move that fast, but it's very mobile, which is a problem given the firing delay and then travel time. The firing delay is the biggest issue, though. The bullet travel time is completely normal. I would recommend just making either the eyeball itself the weak point. I feel like that would be too big, though. Make the weak point the center of the eye, right where the weak point first appears before it starts moving. Just make that a stationary weak point. There is enough going on that the player is going to have enough trouble as it is firing at that, because the mortars have collisions. If your bullet hits them, boom, miss. Alternatively, make it move slower. It moves a little too quickly, and it has too wide of a range of motion that, combined with the other aspects of the fight, are being a problem. Now, it is possible that by fixing the whale's attacks, that the weak point would be less of a problem, but that is something that testing and tweaking would reveal. But experimentation would be good there. I appreciate what you're aiming for, and it is difficult, but it doesn't feel like it's difficult for the right reasons. It's difficult because there's so much going on, and some of it's really sometimes unavoidable depending on timing. Like, that vertical shot can be coming down right when the mortars fire, blocking you from jumping to get out of the way of that, and, the whale. And I like that the boss is more advanced than the first head of the dragon, but I feel like it is also difficult for the wrong reasons in some ways. The boss fight could be improved upon, but visually, it's outstanding. I love that it's different than the first one. It's not just a reskin or a rehash of the first one. It's unique. It seems to be a giant, bigger head in the background, and you're just seeing its eye. And its weird mortar firing eye, but I assume the vertical things are it's firing them out of it. Well, I keep picturing it as a whale, so I was going to say it's firing things out of its blowhole at you. It's not a whale. At least I don't think canonically it is a whale. But you know what I mean. Overall, I'd rate the second head pretty decently, but I feel like it's got a bit too much going on. A lot of the bosses in this game seem to suffer from that. Like the first head, the floating heads were the problem. The second head, you've got too many things with you've got too much of the player's movement blocked off by varying trajectories of attacks. And the third head, we'll get to that. Now, with the second head of the whale, second head of the dragon, whatever you want to call it, defeated, now we move on to what I'm calling the Hallway of White. Now, it is technically a gray hallway, a kind of bluish gray. It's made from the same stone color as the bits of stone jutting out of the two harbor areas. But there's not really a lot to be said here because it is such a small area. Overall, the design is pretty. I like the color. And the layout is kind of nice. It's a long hallway with a few little adjacent rooms, one of them leading to an elevator back to town. There's really no... Oh, well, there is... Never mind. I was going to say there's no enemies, but there is the one room with the giant floating head spawners. I actually like them. They're interesting. The way they're placed in the room, the fact they're stationary, the explodey shadow particles, and their large size makes them actually easy to shoot in midair. They take a lot of bullets, and it seemed like every time I shoot them, they spawn a floating head, so I would have been better off just to run through, grab the thing, and run back out, and then go to the healing station. But, I like them. I'm intrigued by them. I don't understand them. But, yeah. That's the the hallway of light. Technically, we will return to it after the next area, but that's about all that can really be said. As for the next area, or areas, I'm considering the 3 autumn areas to be one area. Now, I've really got to point out a slight note here. It feels like an odd shift. Previously, the game has kind of actively discouraged me from doing backtracking, be it through locked doors or be it through the fact that I'm having to pay limited resources in order to backtrack by shooting blocks. It feels weird to me that suddenly I am sent back to traverse basically the entire game world to find these 3 autumn areas. It just felt like a sharp tonal shift, like suddenly, yes, you backtrack, from no, you no backtrack, and Now, I'm also labeling them first, second, and third autumn based on the order in which I found them. These are not, like, I don't know what order they're intended to be in, so bear with me. It's based on my, like the order you see them in the videos. The first autumn area. First, the autumn area itself is new and unique. The area is beautiful, and the autumn NPC feels fitting for that area. Second, the invisible walls and invisible platforms feel weird. You being invisible and trying to find your way around the invisible platforming. I mean, it's well designed. Like, it's not badly designed. I cannot complain about that at all. I did not struggle with it. I didn't die a bunch of times. It wasn't that bad. It just, I don't know, something about it doesn't feel like it fits. I mean, you're relying on these smoke particles from your player model falling to know where you're at because you're invisible, and then you're just trial and error jumping over invisible platforms, or invisible blockades more than actual platforms. And then the doppelgangers are, I like the idea, but I don't think their execution works really well. They are stationary, insta-kill level hazards, and to me, what is the difference between them and a pit in the ground? You fall in that, you die. You touch that, you die. It's the same thing. And they're all basically ground level. Now, I do like that they are different sizes. I like that. It's neat to see little versions of my player and really big versions, and having to find my way through the platforms to climb over the really big one was neat. But I don't know, it's just something about it doesn't feel fitting. Maybe have some of them move around, have some of them mirror my movements. I mean, you could take a page from some of the older Zelda games where you have to deal with trying to traverse the area while an enemy mirrors your movement, knowing that if you collide, they did a lot of damage there. In this case, they'd be insta-kill, but you know what I mean. There's a lot that can be done with the idea, and I just don't really know what to suggest. Overall, the first autumn area is pretty nice. The gimmick's a little but pretty nice, and it's different. I like the fact that it's different. Anyway, on to the second autumn area. Not a whole lot can be said. The doppelgangers make a return, but they're A, no longer transparent, and B, they're few and far between. They're just kind of incorporated into the level. The Lost Woods style maze, it was pretty neat. There was varying pathways, and I kind of just brute forced my way through it by trial and error, like go through, keep a mental log of every path I've tried and keep doing it until I find the path that works. It was a pretty, they're all pretty short areas, but I liked it. It was pretty nice, and it felt fitting to the autumn forest theme to have the kind of Lost Woods style dungeon. I don't actually know if the Lost Woods was the first one to do that in gaming. That's just generally the one that comes to mind. And I think the trope is called something to that effect. I'm not sure. Not that they're official, but anyway. The third autumn section. This one is honestly my favorite of the 3. Now, the gimmick doesn't exactly feel like it fits the autumn area, but I love the gimmick. And that is that the area is full of invisible landmines, or buried landmines, and then there's signs that give you hints as to their position. Now, I was really bad at this and stepped on a lot of landmines. I'm really glad they're not insta-kill. But overall, it was fun it was the kind of the fun / frustrating that comes from, I know I stepped on it because I made a mistake, not because the game tricked me, not because it was unclear, but just simply because I misread the sign. I loved it. It was a very fun area. And it just really, really hit the nail on the head on the fun but frustrating. But, like the others, not hugely long, and, soon you've got all 3 white keys. That brings us back to the hallway of white. Now, there's really not anything you need to do in the hallway of white at this point. Stop at the save point, refill your health, grab the ammo if you have not grabbed it already, and refill on keys for no good reason! Because I just thought it was going to be important. I think I refilled on keys. I know I at least contemplated it. Now, whether I did it or not, I can't remember. Now, on to the Minotaur, or the third whale. I should point out at the start, I love the design of the boss, and I love what it is aiming to do. I love that it incorporates an attack from the first whale and the second whale. It has the death bloops that follow unique pathways, and it has the sideways firing mortars. I like that. It allows cohesion of the themes. It makes this boss feel connected to the previous bosses. Because in theory, they're all heads of the same entity, with this being its main head. Also really love the background and the fact that if you look at the bottom of the arena, you can see like a bunch of the little heads. So, I mean, I'm kind of picturing this thing as like a Hydra with just lots and lots and lots of heads, with this one being the primary head, I suppose. Also, of it being a dragon guarding the princess and all, plays into those tropes very nicely. But as for the gameplay, the sideways mortars. They're fine in the fight. They didn't cause me problems. I like that they stop when you defeat their associated weak point. But I do think that, like I recommended on the second head, that having them fire up to the top of the screen, spread out, and then come down while leaving only certain platforms safe would be more interactive, but you'd have to slow them down a bit. It can't fire them as quickly because the time to get up to the top and then to fall would take longer, but it would be more interactive with the player. Because as it is in this fight, honestly, the reason the mortars aren't a problem, I can stand out of their range. They're no threat to me. The only time they're a threat is when I'm trying to climb around to the second head, because then I have to jump through the mortars. But I mean, honestly, I love the fact that they're not a threat to me, because there's so much else going on in this fight that if they were a threat to me, it would not be fun. I mean, it would be worse. But that would be my suggestion. As for the death bloops, I love what you're trying to go for here. I love that they are fast. There is a fast variety and a slow variety. I love that there are so many different pathways that they can traverse. My problem: some of these pathways are long and meandering. And by long and meandering, I mean that if we stretched the pathway out into a straight line, it would be very long, because it's sitting here following either circular or back and forth little meandering paths, while others are following paths that take them off the screen quicker. Now, my problem: okay, you've got both sides spawning these things, and you'll often get slow ones following this little meandering path that leads it down through the center and then back out. Now, this is fine if they're the fast ones, but the slow ones and the tendency of RNG to sometimes spawn a bunch of slow ones in a row, all on the same same meandering path, is you end up with a traffic jam underneath the boss that the player is sitting there not doing anything, waiting on them to move, because you don't have a reliable way to shoot them down. Their movements are, well, they're airborne enemies, firing delay, yada yada yada. I'm not really going deep into that again. My 2 suggestions would be either A, make it so that the slow variants cannot go on those long meandering paths. Make the slow variants always go on either shorter paths or paths unique to them. B, make it so that when you destroy a weak point, it stops spawning them entirely. But I think that might be too easy, so that's just a side suggestion. C, make it so that when you destroy a weak point, it stops spawning the slow ones. Make it only spawn fast ones. That allows you to maintain the difficulty, but it also means that traversing the area underneath to get to the second weak point is then a little easier You destroy that one, and suddenly you don't have to worry about slow ones there. You've still got to worry about slow ones coming from the right, but then when you destroy that one, and you're down at the bottom trying to shoot the third weak point, you're only dealing with fast ones, which may actually make things worse. I don't know. But it would certainly make things more interactive, because the slow ones are a pain. Like, they're easy to dodge, but they're a pain when you're trying to get past them. It's like being in a narrow hallway with somebody that's walking down the middle of the hall, and they just slightly meander a little bit, and you keep trying to get around them and get frustrated, and trying to get around them and frustrated. And in this case, you run face first into them and they explode. And that's where the metaphors only go so far. Now, the weak point itself. I like that it has 3 weak points. I like that this weak point is mostly stationary. I don't mind that it's, meandering a little bit versus the other one going... But, surrounding it with the eyeball blocks. My problem. Okay. The bullet blocks and rocket blocks themselves. If I fire a bullet at a rocket block or a rocket at a bullet block, it just, poofs harmlessly. The eyeball blocks play by different rules, and honestly, that's not super clear to the player unless they just dumb luck themselves into it or have a weird, in the middle of work, epiphany like I did. And wait, I didn't try that. You're going to lose a lot of players at that point, just in sheer frustration. But figuring out that I can shoot rockets through the eyeball block tied to the bullet blocks to hit the weak point was... I like that you're kind of forced to use rockets, but I think that it would be nice if there was a clearer message to the player kind of hinting them in that direction. Because otherwise, the only... When the weak point raises up, it goes slightly higher, and I could try to precisely shoot a bullet through there, and it happens once in a while, but to do it 16 times without ever hitting the bullet blocks, with a firing delay, with all the death bloops, would be a nightmare. It would no longer be fun. That would be horror, and that honestly would have been the point that I just quit. Like, if I hadn't... I honestly intended to, if not for the fact that I thought of the shooting the rockets through it part. And I'm glad that worked, but that does need to be looked at. Now, overall, I really like what the boss is aiming to be. I just think that tweaking some things would make it so much better. The game dev may disagree. These are all subjective things. I'm not saying they must be done. But, offering my critique, my constructive feedback. Now, I also should point out that I like that the arena is made strictly of bullet blocks and rocket blocks. I do think there should be some permanent platforms. You shouldn't rely 100% on one or the other. I do understand why, because you want to make sure that shooting the bullet blocks, shooting the eyeballs relating to the bullet blocks is kind of a death sentence. But, because you could no longer make it to the door. We established that I could do that, stand on the rocket blocks, defeat the boss, and then I'm stranded. Which was frustrating in of itself. But something about the layout of the platforms could be tweaked to make that a little more interactive as well. I don't know. There's so many different things that could be done, and so many other previously mentioned changes, like the delay time on firing, could affect these things, so that I can't say what would be the best option. I would just recommend experimenting and tweaking at it a bit. Now, with the wheelhead defeated, the next boss is actually pretty fun and interesting. There are some things I think could be changed and improved, but having a puzzle boss with basically no threat to me, aside from one stray landmine and running out of health due to bullets, it's actually a very welcome change of pace, like I said. I do think the buttons are a little ambiguous. The fact that you have to jump on them instead of just walking over them, it may have just been me, but that took me a little bit to figure out. Now, due to the player's slow walk cycle, I would recommend 2 things. 1, reduce the total number of buttons. But 2, stretch the arena taller. You currently have a ground floor and then kind of one section of platforms on either side that you traverse. Make it 2 sections of platforming tall, but bring the walls in so that the player, has to traverse. Then take the fewer buttons that you now have and scatter them so that it becomes you're hunting for buttons, not just oopa button, oopa button, oopa button, oopa button, oopa button. Because like pushing 4 buttons that are right next to each other and pressing one bigger button that's just right there is about the same thing. So scattering them and hiding them throughout the platforming section, which is now larger and more complex, would be nice. Due to the player's low horizontal movement speed, vertical areas such as the fungal area, or the vertical rooms within the fungal area, feel more fluid and fast-paced because you can move up and down so much faster, and it covers for the weakness of the slow horizontal movement speed. I do think that it would still be an improvement even if you increased the player's horizontal movement speed. Just making the room feel better, more varied. It would give you more room to do more unique platforming, have some moving platforms, the explodey platforms, whatever you want to do. But it would make it feel more interactive. Likewise, I really, really want to know what's behind that door in the bottom left that I never get to go through. Likewise, there's also the door in the king's room with the giant sphere and all that I never get to go through. But I understand you're not going to get to go through every door in every game because that's just world building, that there's always going to be places that you as the player don't get to go. The cube itself. The 8 things, the 4 on the left and the 4 on the right. I really feel like they should have tied more into it. Like, I feel like I should have had to have destroyed all 8 of them to then unlock the cube to where I could shoot the cube. But the platforms don't allow that. There's, I think, 2 of them on the left that I just couldn't shoot because there was no platforms in the needed position to get me close enough to where I could shoot them. I think it would have been neat for me to, have to hunt down all the buttons and then shoot all 8 of the locks and then begin attacking the cube itself. I would recommend having the player firing lots of rockets at the cube instead of bullets, though, because it would feel more thematic that you're, attacking the bunker thing with missiles instead of shooting at it. I likewise think, and this is just me, and it's because during me trying to figure out the cube, it seemed like it would be very thematically fitting. Player, character fires every rocket he has at the cube, dealing enough damage to pass some background threshold. Then he's out of ammo, he's out of everything, and he's out of health. Then he comes and stands in front of it and accidentally steps on the landmine, survives, and there could be, I don't know. It makes sense in my head, but there's this weird sort of thematic, he feels like he's failed in his mission, and he's thinks he's, I don't know. When I was playing it, it seemed like the front of the cube had, the blood-stained red on it, and there's a landmine right in front of it, and my thought was, what if he fails and dies right there, and that's what gets her to come out of the cube, like, oh, noble knight, you've made yada-yada sacrifice, or whatever. But, I don't know. It seemed interesting, and it's probably really random. It's also kind of dark, but it seems like it would fit the thematic of the game. Not that I want the player character to die. I would hope he'd survive somehow. But it just felt surreal. And it was one of the things I tested while trying to figure out how on earth to get into the cube. Before trying the just hit it with all the bullets method, which ended up working. The boss fight as a whole is nice. I just feel like it could be streamlined. Now, streamlined is not the right word. Polished. I know I'm using the word polish a lot, but it's kind of the best word I've got for these things. Making the area taller with more platforming, reducing the number of buttons, then scattering them throughout the now larger area so that it's you're hunting for buttons instead of just tripping over them, because there's so many of them. Then having to shoot all of the locks off the cube, then attacking the cube with explosives would, to me, thematically fit together better. But that's just my opinion. The boss itself is a very welcome change of pace, though. It supplies you with everything you need to do it within the room itself, so there's no way for the player to reach that point and then, oh no, I'm out of ammo, I cannot complete game, sort of situation. There's a save point right before it, so if you fail, you don't have to deal with the third head again, which is, again, a welcome boon. When you have multiple bosses in a row like that, especially when there's stuff like puzzle conditions, having a save point there is a really nice thing. But that's the cube, and then you end with the running away from the first boss, which catches up with me because I can't run. I thought that was hilarious. Now, in summary of the game as a whole, firstly, I'm going to mention this mainly because I've kind of hinted at it a couple times, and I said there was something about testing that I would explain later. It is my understanding from a post made by ArcHouse themselves that there were no outside testers involved in this game. They strictly relied on inside testing. The problem with this, and I know that it's very tempting to do so, like when designing programs, games, anything, it's very tempting to just rely on either you or a very small, close internal group to do testing. And this can be good, but it can lead to an echo chamber effect. One, ideas that they think are good, but that the outside world would not agree with, end up being cemented into structure. Two, like the builder of a maze who thinks the maze is too easy because he has foreknowledge of the layout of the maze, when designing a game, you know where everything is. You know where every enemy is, how they move, how they think. You've designed their AI and all. You know where every bullet drop is, every save point, every health station. You know the map inside and out. And you also know all the tricks, all the platforming, everything you have to do, so you never go through that phase of figuring things out that a first-time player would, which often causes one to underestimate the difficulty of the game. In this case, that is exactly what happened, and the game dev is quoted as saying that they thought the game was too easy. So they didn't understand why people were finding it hard. And I think a lot of that has to do with them having that foreknowledge. Now, they since realized why, internal testing may have been a bad idea and all, and I'm not criticizing. I understand it's something that happens. It's a tempting thing to do. But, I mentioned that I would explain the testing comment later, and thus I have. Now, ArcHouse is an amazing game dev. The games that I've seen that they have made are, great. They generally... The two I have played thus far have both suffered from a little bit of mechanical trouble, but the art style in the world, beautiful. I adore this game. ArcHouse never ceases to amaze me with their artistic talent and their ability to create these truly unique and interesting worlds with unique and interesting characters, unique and interesting dialogue, etc. But the game falters when it comes to its mechanics. Now, the game is completable and it is fun, but it is also at times more frustrating than it is fun, mainly in part to do with some things that I will cover in the next section. But what I would recommend, one, would be for ArcHouse to work together with somebody that specializes with mechanics and balance, bring their artistic ability to the table, let the whoever specializing in mechanics bring what they bring to the table and create something that satisfies both requirements. Honestly, I believe that this game, specifically this game, if you took and polished up these mechanical problems, the game itself has so much potential. I would recommend expanding the plot a little bit and, explaining some things a bit better. Take the information from the web page and all and implant it into the game, or have a manual that explains things. But, that's me. I love lore. One of the reasons I love the Dark Souls and such games like Dark Souls, Metroid Prime 1, or even the Five Nights series, having lore kind of sprinkled and scattered through it, surface lore, deeper lore, and all of these things that you've got players kind of digging out and finding. And I think that's partially what cemented those communities so heavily was the lore hunting. Things I would personally suggest to polish and or change within the game. Firstly, the player's horizontal movement speed. Now, I don't care if the player starts slow. That's fine. Having a sense of growth is great. Either increase the player's natural movement speed, or have them slow but find an upgrade later, or have a sprint ability. I don't care if the player is not able to fire the gun at all while sprinting, or rocket, fire any weapons while sprinting, but allowing us to sprint would, A, make traveling so much more pleasant. There's a lot of walking in this game, and it's really obnoxious when it's slow. B, it would allow a lot more variety in platforming, because now you can have wider gaps that require you to sprint jump over them. You can have bigger, more complex traps. You can have sections where you've got to sprint, jump, stop, make a normal jump, and etc. There's a lot. It's hard to like verbalize it, but there's a lot that can be done there. Likewise, I would love to see a double jump and a dash and all sorts of things, but I love mobility. But within the scope of the game as it is, just simply faster movement, speed, horizontally speaking. The vertical gravity is fine. We don't want that faster. Don't make him fall faster. Like, super fast jumps. Now, the gun. Get rid of the firing delay, for the love of all that is holy. Either that, or make it so that you press and hold down the firing button, maintain control of your character, and when you release the button, he fires after having readied it. I get the animation, I get all that, but having a weapon that the player is going to be firing frequently in midair that locks my inputs and has an obnoxious delay up front on me pushing the button versus when the result happens it doesn't feel good for the player. It's frustrating, and honestly, it comes across like artificial difficulty. And if you're going to rely on artificial difficulty, you've got to do a good job of hiding it, because if at any point the player feels that something was done strictly for artificial difficulty, it becomes frustrating. Case in point, I'm probably going to get the name wrong, either the Rat Authority or Rat Vanguard from Dark Souls 2. The one that involves the giant reskinned version of Sif and some rat dogs. Everybody knows that those rat dogs are just there because without them the boss would be too easy, but with them the boss is frustrating and obnoxious. Unless you're a pyromancer, in which case, hooray for the thing that leaves the exploding fire landmine. Instantly gone are the rats. But that would be an example of something that I consider artificial difficulty that's not hidden. Their presence or lack thereof makes it go from too easy to too hard. And it stands out as a glaring thing to the player. Now, I know some people probably love the way that fight was designed. Don't get me wrong. Subjectivity is heavily at play when difficulty and design are involved. I'm just using that as an example of what I consider to be artificial difficulty. Putting a delay on firing, to me, is strictly there so that either A, it's because it's surreal, we're calling it a sword, so let's give it a sword-like wind-up, or B, it's there because, well, we don't want the player to be able to aim too well, so this will make it harder for them to hit targets. If it is B, that is a problem. If it is A, it's just frustrating. Either way, the firing delay to me is a problem, and locking my inputs is likewise a problem because of how often I'm having to fire in midair. There is a situation in which locking my inputs would work, but that is mainly if you can only shoot on the ground, and if it's a firing system where I'm holding down the button, which brings up, something for me to aim with, and then me releasing the button aims. Now, if you want to make it so that I can only fire on the ground and I have to press the button, and he brings out the gun, and then I'm like aiming with a laser targeter or something, that's fine. It's still going to be something that needs polish, and I don't know how well it would fit into the game as it currently is, but it could be done. But generally, the game as it is, the firing delay is an issue, like a big issue. It's one of the reasons that I don't like dealing with airborne targets in this game. Like, I don't mind them in a Mega Man game or a Metroid game where it just means jump and like time my button push to where it needs to be. But when I start having to run calculations in my head to figure out where the firing delay needs me to shoot it, I think you're going to get a lot of difficulty out of that. Not good difficulty. Now, those are the only two main mechanics I would really change. There's a few aesthetic things I might suggest, like in the harbor area, reducing the horizontally moving particles and increase the steam. But those are aesthetic, artistic things, and I'm not really well versed in such. That's just my thought. And I would leave that to the, clearly they know what they're doing. Arc House, art people, or person. I'm not 100% sure if Arc House is a single person or a studio. I'm puzzled on that. I think it's just one person, but I'm not 100% sure, and I'm probably wrong. I'm really bad about second guessing myself. Now, as for there's 3 bosses that I would mainly suggest changing things to, and I bet you can guess which 3 they are. The whales. Now, the first head. Take the ghost heads out of the equation completely, please. They're not helping. They are taking away from the boss fight. Now, the first phase feels pretty well fine. The second phase, again, remove the floating ghost heads. Add some new trajectories to the death bloops. Have the boss add something to its fight, but the floating heads are not adding to the fight. They're just a nuisance. They're just there to run into me, because I'm not shooting them. Now, the third phase, honestly, with the aforementioned added new trajectories or some new gimmick from the second phase, and the lightning that's already being added in the third phase, I think the first whalehead would be a lot more of an interactive and interesting fight. Now, I would recommend slowing down the frequency of the lightning bolts a bit, because, they seem to... there doesn't seem to be much time for the player really to interact with them. Generally, you want them to be something that the player is seeing a sign that it's coming and having to jump, move out of its path. Maybe have the water begins to glow or something where it's going to strike. I don't know. Be kind of like Dark Souls 3, the fight with Slave Knight Gale. You see marks where the lightning bolts are going to be, and I love the way they incorporated the lightning into that fight. My only real complaint was that making him get struck by lightning didn't do as much damage as I hoped. That would have been a real fun thing, like if one way to beat him was just lure him into the lightning to chip away at his health. But overall, the first head, that would be my suggestion. Get rid of the ghost heads. Don't take them out of the game entirely, but they've got no place in the fight with the whale head. Now the second head, again with the ghost heads. Please. But no, the whale itself, I would recommend changing the mortar attack. One, it fires a little too frequently. The little side fire exploding bits. What I would suggest having them do, instead of doing this, where they come and just fall to the platforms, have them fire up like 2 larger orbs, which then split. And then, you look at the top of the screen and you can see they're all going to fall straight down, but there's a gap, so you know exactly which platform to stand on, creating a safe zone. But I think by doing that, and having it happen on both sides, so whichever side the player's on, they'll deal with it accordingly, would make the mortars far more interactive to deal with, but it would also make it so that they're not firing into your face every time you jump. Because jumping around is such a large part of the boss fight, given that you're standing on scattered broken platforms, putting something that shoots right into the line of your jump, to me, is a little bit... that frustrated me. And I think that having them fire up and come back down would be a lot more interactive. Likewise, while on the subject of things coming down, you've got what looks like a lightning bolt, the little lightning bolt coming down, and when it hits the bottom, the whale bites. I like the idea. But I would suggest having a delay. The thing comes down, hits the bottom, then 1, 2, whale bite. Have some delay on it. Having it come down and then just instantly spawn the whale makes them feel like, I know they're the same attack technically, but having them more disconnected would mean the player can move to the side and avoid the initial bolt, but then they've got to remember, to jump out of the way for the whale. And it just allows the timing on things to feel a lot more fluid, in my opinion. I love the concept of the biting whale and it being tied to that, but, even if you removed the initial vertical shot and you just had some kind of disturbance in the water you had to watch for because the whale was fixing to bite where you're at. So then you're watching the top of the screen to figure out where the mortars are coming, watching the bottom of the screen to figure out where the whale's going to bite. There's a lot for the player to do. And then with the firing delay fixed, shooting at the weak point that's doing this wouldn't be such a problem. Personally, I think the weak point should be the center of the giant eyeball. The floating weak point just doesn't, to me, it doesn't feel cohesive to the boss. You know, maybe if you added some kind of tendril to connect it, like it's the pupil of the eye has popped out and it's still attached and it's moving around, it would look a little weird, but it would feel like it's connected to the boss at least. As it is, it feels like a floating energy bloop that just escaped from the whale and is somehow connected to it. Somehow intangibly connected to it. There's a nice little difficulty, like the added difficulty of having to shoot a moving object, which is made worse by the firing delay, but, you know, I'm assuming that would be fixed. You know, that's my only real critiques about the second Whalehead. And I know I've mentioned these before, this is just kind of a summary. But I feel like those changes would make the second head feel a lot more like an organic and interactive fight, where the player is actually interacting with the environment instead of just frantically trying to jump around stuff and frantically try to shoot. Now the third head. Yay, no floating heads this time! Because if they were there, that would have been probably a deal breaker or even worse. Main thing I would suggest, to do the tweaks to the slow moving death bloops. Make them not follow the meandering paths, or make it so that the slow ones don't spawn anymore when their respective weak point has been destroyed. But just make it less of a traffic jam situation where the player is stuck behind a bunch of them. It's frustrating. It's not fun frustrating, it's just frustrating. Likewise, bringing the previously mentioned changes to the mortars would be nice. Because honestly, in the third fight, the mortars are not even a threat. I can stand out of their path. And I don't know how to feel about that. I liked it. It was one less thing to worry about. The third weak point, I'd say make it a little clearer to the player what they need to do there. Because I spent more time chasing like methods that weren't going to help me in the end. And, you know, it felt like, I feel like that's something that a lot of players are going to get stuck and frustrated on. You know, likewise, it'll make the fight feel more interactive like the previous ones, and less like rush hour traffic simulator with death. That's pretty much the list of suggestions I would have for the game, or at least the ones I could think of. I really do love this game. A part of me is frustrated because I think it has so much more potential than what it's able to achieve with the mechanical flaws that are currently in it. Underneath it all, I'd consider it a diamond in the rough. I would highly recommend it on its artistic merit alone, but I feel like if Arkhouse was to go back through it and polish up these mechanical things, expand on the plot a little bit, draw some of the other, you know, material into the game or into a manual, this could really be made into a fuller experience. This could be made into a game that you could actually like sell. I know that's what Arkhouse wanted to do, and they ended up not doing it because of the concerns and mechanical things. But I do think that it could be remastered, polished up, and I wouldn't even call it a remaster because you don't even have to change any of the assets. Like, the art is gorgeous. A few little tweaks here and there to like particle density, but you know, it's gorgeous. It's just fix the underlying mechanics of the game, and this could truly, like, it could be a very popular thing. I would keep in mind that, you know, even Scott Cawthon struggled until he managed to just hit that right formula, and, you know, boom, Five Nights was supposed to be his last game. He was giving up on game design after that. But, you know, he managed to hit the right formula, and it worked. I do think that this game, if polished up, could really be a genre-defining thing. I would love to see survival horror brought into other genres, and I think you're onto something. I think that you could expand the Metroidvania aspects a bit, but I don't know how to do that in a survival horror aspect, so it might be best to keep it within the bounds of platformer, action platformer, etc. I have in the past even seen a survival horror, like a full studio release survival horror RPG in Parasite Eve back in the earlier PlayStation. The first Parasite Eve specifically had more RPG elements. The second one went for more of what I have heard compared to kind of the Resident Evil style. There's enemies in the room and you're kind of just meandering about trying to shoot them without really having any bullet control. I don't know. The second one struck me as weird. To me, the story of the second one went off the rails a fair bit, and I think there's a third one, but I've never gotten to play it. I think it's like Parasite Eve Third Birthday or something. I don't know if it ever actually released or if it, I don't know. I lost track of it after that. The second one kind of just went so far off the rails. That's a side tangent, though. What I mean is that survival horror can be blended into so many different gameplay styles. I'm glad to see one blended into platforming. I love this game, and I really think that it has potential. Arkhouse, if you ever happen to see this, thank you for the game. Thanks for the opportunity to play it, and thanks for managing to motivate me to try to make a full review of a game, because I've never actually done anything of this scale before. If you're not familiar with Dark Dreams' other games, there's a link to in the description to their website. I highly recommend looking through their library. They are amazing with their art. I don't know anything about the other games they have made aside from the screenshots, but the screenshots look beautiful. But this has been Suladan Reviews Dark Dreams RHN. Thank you for watching. If you would like to join us in the Discord channel, there is a link in the banner, a link in the description. Likewise, the channel's Twitter feed and Patreon are also linked if one desires. Feel free to comment or whatever. You know, I'm open to constructive criticism, game requests, etc. I currently have 2 games in the request list that I need to get to at some point, but, you know, I'm getting to them when I'm getting to them. I'm convinced somebody wants to kill me because somebody recommended I play Getting Over It with Minute Foddy. In any case, I'm going to go ahead and pause here. Like I said, thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next game.